A racist lifeguard decided to ignore cries for help when a black girl began drowning in a pool. He had no idea who her father would turn out to be and what consequences lay ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and post in the comments where you're watching us from. The morning air at the Laguna Bay Resort was thick with the warmth of early summer, filled with the distant hum of waves crashing on a sandy shore and the laughter of vacationers eager to soak in every last bit of sunshine. Towering palm trees cast slender shadows over the pathways that wove through manicured gardens, bursting with bougainvillea and hibiscus. This oasis was a haven for families, couples, and anyone else hoping to escape the stress of daily life and immerse themselves in luxury. The Smith family was no exception. After months of intense work, FBI agent Jason Smith had finally put his work aside, packed his bags, and flown with his family to the celebrated island retreat. Jason hoped that the magic of Laguna Bay would wipe away the fatigue and tension of his job. For him, this vacation wasn't just about rest. It was a rare chance to devote every moment to his wife and children, free from the constant demands of his position. Jason was a sturdy man in his 40s with a strong, watchful presence. His broad shoulders and solid frame could almost seem intimidating, but his eyes held a warmth that hinted at his softer side, especially when he looked at his family. He valued fairness, and his loyalty to protecting justice was second only to his devotion to his wife, Lisa, and their 2 children. It had been a few years since he'd taken such a break, and he was determined to make every minute of this trip count. Jason's wife, Lisa, embodied calm and grace. Her warm laughter came easily, and she carried a natural elegance that matched her gentle yet firm demeanor. She kept the family grounded, balancing Jason's intensity with her steady optimism. For Lisa, this vacation was a chance to reconnect, and she was thrilled to watch her husband relax after so many late nights and difficult cases. Then there was 12-year-old Amelia, their firstborn. The girl had an unshakable confidence, a result of her achievements as a swimmer, where she'd already collected more medals than anyone could count. Amelia's presence was quietly powerful. She approached life with a calm assurance beyond her years. She was sensitive to the world around her, often noticing things others missed. And although she carried a bright smile most of the time, she had an inner strength that made her father proud. Beside Amelia was her younger brother, 8-year-old Sammy, a bundle of energy and curiosity. Sammy idolized his sister and followed her around, trying to emulate her every move. He was still young enough to find joy in nearly everything, from chasing lizards along the path to trying every dessert on the buffet. For him, this trip was an adventure, and he felt like he'd stepped into a dream. The family had spent most of their first day exploring the hotel and settling into their spacious suite. Their room overlooked the resort's massive lagoon-style pool, which curved and twisted around rocky inlets and flowering gardens. The crystal-clear water sparkled under the sun, and it seemed to be calling them to jump in. Amelia had been the first to run down to the pool, with Sammy trailing closely behind her, eager to follow her lead. As the family approached the poolside loungers to claim a spot, they noticed a lifeguard on duty. He stood tall and rigid, scanning the water with an intensity that made him seem unapproachable. His name tag read Chad. He was a young man in his mid-20s, muscular, with close-cropped blonde hair and a weathered tan from hours spent in the sun. But something about his demeanor didn't quite fit the welcoming atmosphere of the resort. His gaze, while sweeping over the pool, seemed to linger a bit too long when it came across Jason and his family, his expression unreadable yet uncomfortable. Jason didn't dwell on it for long, chalking it up to exhaustion from travel. He directed his attention back to his children, who were already at the edge of the pool, and Lisa, who was slipping into a beach chair beside him, sighing contentedly. Jason wanted this to be a time free from worry, but there was a part of him that couldn't completely let go. The part trained to observe, to notice the small things. The first day passed quickly. The children alternated between swimming and building sandcastles by the beach, and by evening they were happily tired. At dinner, the family shared laughs and stories while sampling the resort's incredible seafood. As the sky turned pink, they returned to their room, watching the last hints of sunset from their balcony. Jason felt a deep sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. But even then, as he looked out over the peaceful resort, he couldn't quite shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning dawned bright and clear. After breakfast, the Smith family made their way to the pool, ready for another day in paradise. As they set up in the same spot, Jason noticed Chad on duty again, standing at his post with that same stoic expression. This time, Jason paid closer attention. Chad's gaze seemed fixed on them, cold and unreadable. Jason's instincts as an agent stirred. He'd learned to trust his gut over years of working high-stress cases, and something about this man felt off. Jason shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. They were here to enjoy themselves, and he refused to let his guard spoil it. But then, Amelia, who had noticed Chad's stare, whispered, "Dad, why does he keep looking at us?" Jason hesitated, feeling the need to protect her innocence, but also wanting to be honest. "I'm not sure, sweetheart. Some people just have a strange way of showing they're doing their job." He gave her a reassuring smile, hoping to dismiss her concern. Amelia shrugged, brushing it off with her usual calm composure, and dove gracefully into the pool, her strokes strong and confident. Sammy followed with a splash, giggling as he tried to keep up with his sister. For the next few hours, the family enjoyed their time together. They swam, lounged, and even joined a beach volleyball game with some other families. Chad seemed to disappear from their thoughts, his presence blending into the background as they lost themselves in the carefree joy of vacation. But Jason continued to observe him, every now and then catching a glimpse of that same cold gaze directed their way. Was it paranoia from a man too used to being on alert, or was there something more to it? He reminded himself that not everything required an explanation, yet there was a part of him that couldn't completely dismiss it. The second day at Laguna Bay Resort was filled with the promise of relaxation. The resort had an endless array of activities and amenities, and the Smith family intended to enjoy them all. After an early breakfast, they made their way back to the pool, ready for another day of sun and swimming. The air was warm and scented with salt from the nearby ocean, and guests from all over were already claiming their spots around the massive pool, setting up umbrellas, lounge chairs, and beach towels. Jason lay back in his chair, looking out over the bright blue water, letting himself sink into the tranquil sounds of laughter, splashes, and distant music playing softly from hidden speakers around the pool area. He had waited a long time for this, a vacation free of danger, free of the pressure of cases and field work. Here, he was simply a father, a husband, and for once, he could let down his guard, or so he thought. The children, eager to jump in, were quick to shed their sandals and dash toward the water. Amelia dove in first, cutting through the water with smooth, practiced strokes. She was graceful and self-assured, her movements reflecting the years she had dedicated to swimming. Sammy, not as adept but full of enthusiasm, splashed in beside her, trying to keep up, laughing as his sister pulled ahead. Lisa settled beside Jason, her sunglasses shielding her eyes as she sighed contentedly. "Can you believe we're finally here?" she murmured, squeezing his hand. Jason nodded, watching their kids. "I know. This feels perfect." And it did. Almost. But that unsettling feeling from the day before lingered. It was faint, just a whisper in his mind. But it was there. Chad, the lifeguard, was stationed at the far end of the pool, once again scanning the crowd. Jason caught him looking their way and frowned. He had noticed Chad's attention yesterday, but he hadn't thought much of it. Now, though, as Chad's gaze seemed to linger on Amelia, a chill ran down Jason's spine. Lisa noticed his expression. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Jason replied, forcing a smile. "Just an old habit." Lisa chuckled, knowing well enough how difficult it was for him to completely relax. "You're not on duty, Jason. Let yourself enjoy it." Jason smiled and nodded, but his eyes drifted back to Chad. His instincts, honed over years of working in law enforcement, told him that something was off. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but he also couldn't ignore it. Amelia, meanwhile, was entirely unaware of the lifeguard's attention. She was focused on racing her brother, encouraging him to swim faster, cheering him on when he started to lag behind. They were laughing together, Sammy's delighted giggles echoing across the pool. Jason's heart swelled watching them, grateful for this time to be together. But then, just as he was starting to relax, he noticed Chad again. This time, the lifeguard wasn't just looking at them. He seemed to be sneering, his lips curling up in a faint smirk. Jason tensed, trying to read the expression, but Chad turned away before he could be sure. For a moment, Jason felt a surge of anger. Why was this man, a stranger, looking at his family with such disdain? He clenched his fist, forcing himself to breathe. It was possible he was reading too much into it. He was supposed to be relaxing, after all, not analyzing every person who glanced his way. But even as he tried to shake it off, something about Chad's expression lingered, planting a seed of doubt that Jason couldn't ignore. As the morning passed, the Smith family's routine continued, with Amelia and Sammy playing in the water while Lisa and Jason watched from their loungers. But just as Jason started to put the odd encounter with Chad out of his mind, Amelia approached the edge of the pool, her expression troubled. "Dad," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder at Chad, "why does that guy keep looking at us like that?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. He'd hoped that his kids hadn't noticed Chad's strange behavior. Putting on a reassuring smile, he reached out to ruffle her wet hair. "I wouldn't worry about it, sweetheart. He's just doing his job." "But he was... I don't know." She hesitated, as if struggling to put her feelings into words. "It's like he doesn't like us. I heard him say something too. It sounded... mean." A surge of protectiveness flared up in Jason's chest. He looked over at Chad, who was now helping a young couple with their pool equipment, his expression perfectly neutral. Jason didn't like that his daughter felt uncomfortable, and he didn't want her to think that anyone had a reason to look down on her. "Listen, Amelia, you don't need to worry about him. Some people are just... strange," he said, choosing his words carefully. Amelia nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. She turned and dove back into the water, disappearing beneath the surface in a series of smooth strokes. Jason watched her for a moment, feeling a mix of pride and concern. Over the next few days, the family threw themselves into the resort's activities. They went on a guided snorkeling trip where Sammy tried to touch every fish he saw, and Amelia impressively kept pace with the instructor, who complimented her on her skills. They lounged on the beach, played volleyball, and explored the local shops in the nearby village. For the most part, it was everything they had hoped for. But Chad continued to be a thorn in Jason's side. Every time they returned to the pool, there he was, watching. Jason tried to tell himself that Chad was just doing his job, but the lifeguard's gaze carried a weight, a judgment that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just passive observation. It felt active, directed, and every so often, Chad would let slip a comment that made Jason's blood boil. One afternoon, as Jason was helping Sammy with his floaties, he overheard Chad speaking with a colleague. The lifeguard's voice was low, but his tone carried a mocking edge. "Some people really think they belong anywhere, huh?" he muttered, glancing Jason's way with a smirk. His colleague laughed awkwardly, looking uncomfortable. Jason's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want to cause a scene, especially not with his family there. He could confront Chad, but he knew it would only lead to trouble. Instead, he decided to focus on his family, to make sure they enjoyed their time no matter what. One evening, the Smith family met another couple at dinner, the Thompsons, who had 2 daughters close to Amelia's age. The families quickly hit it off, and the girls bonded over their love of swimming. Jason found himself enjoying the company of Mr. Thompson, who shared stories of his own family vacations, and the 2 men swapped tales of fatherhood over cocktails. As the adults chatted, Amelia and the Thompson girls planned a swimming race for the next day. Amelia's excitement was infectious, and Jason was grateful for the distraction. He wanted his daughter to enjoy every moment, to remember this trip as something special, even if Chad's presence continued to gnaw at him. The next morning, the Smiths and the Thompsons gathered at the pool, cheering on the girls as they prepared for their race. Chad was on duty again, leaning against the lifeguard chair, looking bored. Jason noticed his gaze flicking toward Amelia, his expression hardening. It was as if the lifeguard couldn't stand to see her so happy, so free. When the race began, Amelia surged forward with her powerful strokes, quickly gaining the lead. Her friends followed closely, laughing and splashing as they tried to keep up. Jason watched with pride, cheering her on, his heart swelling as she reached the finish line first. But as he looked up, he saw Chad staring, his eyes filled with a cold, silent fury. Jason felt a shiver run down his spine. Something was wrong. He knew it now with absolute certainty. Chad's hostility wasn't just in his head, it was real, and it was directed at his family. The 3rd day of their vacation dawned, bright and calm, as though the world was conspiring to provide Jason with the perfect conditions for relaxation. But the memory of Chad's cold gaze and barely concealed hostility had lingered with him all night, overshadowing the ease he had hoped to find here. Jason tried to set his concerns aside, telling himself once again that he was overthinking things, but his instincts, honed by years on the job, told him otherwise. As the family made their way down to the breakfast buffet, Jason felt the familiar weight of duty settle over him, pressing against his wish for rest. It was as if the tension of his work was following him, creeping into the cracks of his vacation, and he wondered if he could ever truly escape it. The dining area was bustling, and the air smelled of coffee, fresh fruit, and pastries. Lisa immediately struck up a conversation with another family they had met the day before, leaving Jason momentarily alone with his thoughts. He glanced around, scanning the room, a habit he had developed on the job and hadn't quite managed to shake, even here. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and the clinking of silverware, Yet something felt off. Just then, Lisa returned to his side, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Hey," she said softly, "you seem distracted. Are you okay?" Jason forced a smile, reaching out to take her hand. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, you know me. It's hard to turn off sometimes." Lisa gave him a sympathetic smile. She knew all too well how his job had shaped him, how his vigilance had become a second nature. "You're not on duty, Jason. Try to relax for all of us, okay?" He nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. She was right. They had come here to escape his demanding work, to reconnect as a family. He resolved to push Chad out of his mind, at least for now. After breakfast, they returned to the pool, where Amelia and Sammy were quick to jump in, already laughing and splashing as they began a game of tag. Jason settled into a lounge chair beside Lisa, watching his kids, feeling the knot of tension in his chest start to loosen. But his relaxation was short-lived. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Chad again, stationed at the lifeguard stand, his gaze firmly fixed on the pool. Jason watched as the lifeguard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he looked at Amelia. It wasn't the vigilant gaze of a lifeguard protecting his guests. It was something darker, something menacing. Jason's mind flashed back to previous encounters with hostility and discrimination in his own life. Memories surfaced of his younger years, of moments he'd faced similar looks and judgment. It was painful, knowing that his children might be subjected to the same. He felt a wave of protectiveness rise in his chest. He had spent his life fighting for justice, working to protect others, but he hadn't expected to confront this kind of hostility on a family vacation. As he sat there, torn between wanting to confront Chad and wanting to keep his family safe, Lisa noticed his tension. She reached over, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You're still on edge, aren't you?" Jason hesitated, glancing over at Chad. He didn't want to burden Lisa with his concerns, didn't want to ruin their trip, but he also couldn't ignore what he was feeling. "It's that lifeguard," he said finally, his voice low. "There's something wrong about him. The way he looks at us, at the kids, it's not normal." Lisa followed his gaze, her expression skeptical. "Are you sure, Jason? Maybe he's just not friendly. Not everyone has to like us, you know." Jason shook his head, frustrated. "It's more than that. He's hostile, and he's not even trying to hide it." Lisa sighed, brushing her hair back. "Look, I get that you're on alert, but maybe you're reading too much into this. We're here to relax, remember? For the kids. They're happy. That's what matters." Jason wanted to agree, wanted to believe that it was just his overactive instincts making him suspicious, but every time he tried to dismiss it, his mind circled back to Chad's icy stare and the sneering comments he had overheard. Deep down, he knew that his instincts were right. The day continued, and Jason tried to put his worries aside, but he couldn't ignore the growing feeling of dread. He watched his children more closely than ever, his eyes flickering over to Chad whenever he was nearby. The lifeguard's presence loomed over them, a dark cloud on the edges of their idyllic holiday. That evening, as they returned to their room, Jason felt the weight of his concerns pressing down on him. After Lisa and the kids had gone to bed, he found himself alone on the balcony, gazing out at the darkened resort grounds. The air was cool and quiet, and he could hear the distant sound of the ocean, steady and calming. But the peace only served to intensify his unease. He thought back to his days in the academy, to the training sessions that had drilled vigilance into him, to always trust his instincts. He had faced dangers that were direct and immediate, threats that could be identified and neutralized. But this was different. It was subtle, creeping, like a shadow hiding in plain sight. He knew he couldn't ignore it, but he was torn between his duty to protect and his desire to keep this trip intact for his family. The next morning, over breakfast, Jason decided to have a quiet word with the hotel's management. He approached the concierge, a well-dressed man with a polished smile, and asked if he could speak with someone about a concern. "Yes, Mr. Smith, of course," the man replied, leading Jason to a private office. Jason explained his observations, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to make outright accusations, but he wanted them to understand that something felt wrong. The concierge listened politely, nodding, his face betraying no reaction. "We'll certainly look into this, sir," he said with a professional smile. "Thank you for bringing it to our attention." Jason nodded, though he sensed that his concerns had been brushed off. As he returned to his family, he couldn't shake the feeling that his words had fallen on deaf ears. He hoped he was wrong, that Chad would be monitored more closely. But deep down, he knew that the lifeguard would continue watching them, unchecked. Later that day, as they returned to the pool, Jason noticed Chad stationed in the same place, his expression as stony as ever. There was no indication that anyone had spoken to him, no sign of a change in his behavior. He continued to watch Jason's family with the same cold disdain, as if the hotel's intervention had done nothing to deter him. Jason's frustration mounted. He felt trapped, unable to protect his family from this subtle threat, unable to confront Chad directly without causing a scene. The conflict tore at him, fueling his anger and helplessness. As the afternoon wore on, Jason found himself torn between wanting to confront Chad and wanting to keep his family's peace intact. He didn't want to alarm them, didn't want to turn this vacation into a battlefield, but he couldn't ignore the threat any longer. Finally, he made a decision. He would keep a closer watch, stay near the kids at all times, and if Chad made another move, any move that crossed the line, Jason would take action, vacation or not. The resolve settled over him, a determination that made him feel, for the first time in days, like he was back in control. He would protect his family no matter what. The next day, the resort bustled with activity. The sun was high, casting a warm glow over the pool as families and couples basked in the heat, dipping into the cool water to escape the intense rays. The Smith family had begun their day with breakfast, the children chatting excitedly about their plans to swim, play, and enjoy every last minute of this getaway. Jason had told himself to relax, to let the tension that had built up over the last few days finally fade. He was here to be with his family, and he didn't want Chad to ruin their time together. So, after breakfast, he and Lisa found chairs near the pool while Amelia and Sammy prepared to dive in. He settled back in his chair, making an effort to enjoy the sun on his face, the sound of laughter filling the air. But, despite his best efforts, he couldn't fully shake the unease that had been haunting him. Amelia stretched, adjusting her goggles as she prepared to dive. She was in her element here, confident and fearless in the water. Jason smiled as he watched her, feeling a swell of pride. Sammy was already splashing nearby, calling out to his sister, challenging her to a race across the pool. Jason's eyes swept over to the lifeguard stand, and there was Chad, stationed at his usual spot, watching over the pool, and, once again, watching them. His gaze, intense and unblinking, was fixed on Amelia as she prepared to take her first dive of the morning. Jason's muscles tensed. He wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that maybe this time Chad was just doing his job, but the icy look in the lifeguard's eyes seemed to betray a deeper resentment, an animosity Jason couldn't ignore. Amelia dove in, her form cutting through the water with ease, her arms and legs moving in practiced coordination. She swam with a grace that spoke to years of training and dedication. Jason watched, captivated by her skill, his heart swelling with pride. But just as she reached the deep end of the pool, something went wrong. One moment, Amelia was gliding through the water, strong and confident. The next, she froze, her body jerking as if in pain. Her face twisted in discomfort, her hand clutching at her leg as she began to sink. Jason's heart stopped. He recognized the signs, a cramp, one severe enough to immobilize her. Amelia's expression shifted from surprise to panic as she struggled to keep her head above water. Her lips parted, and she gasped, trying to call out, but her voice was lost in the splashing and laughter around her. She waved her arms frantically, trying to stay afloat, her face etched with fear. Jason shot to his feet, his instincts kicking in immediately. "Amelia!" he called, his voice barely audible over the commotion. He started moving toward the edge of the pool, his heart pounding as he watched his daughter struggle. But even as he prepared to dive in himself, he glanced up at the lifeguard stand. Chad was watching, his gaze locked on Amelia, but he wasn't moving. Jason's mind raced. The lifeguard was supposed to react immediately, to jump in and help her, but Chad remained rooted to his spot, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jason's blood boiled as he realized what was happening. Chad was watching his daughter drown, and he was doing nothing to stop it. "Amelia!" Jason shouted again, louder this time, desperation edging into his voice. His eyes met Chad's, and for a split second he saw something cold and calculating in the lifeguard's gaze, something that made his stomach churn. Without another thought, Jason dove into the pool. The water enveloped him, cool and heavy, as he propelled himself toward Amelia. His heart pounded in his chest as he swam with all his strength, every muscle straining as he closed the distance between them. He could see her struggling just ahead, her movements frantic, her face contorted with fear. When he finally reached her, Jason wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as he kicked toward the surface. She was gasping, her eyes wide and terrified, her hands clutching onto him with a desperation that broke his heart. He could feel her muscles tensed from the cramp, her body shaking from the shock and fear of the experience. "It's okay, sweetheart. I've got you," he murmured, his voice soothing as he held her close. He could feel her body start to relax, her breathing becoming more steady as she clung to him. Jason glanced toward the lifeguard stand as he guided Amelia toward the edge of the pool, fury burning in his chest. Chad was still standing there, his expression indifferent, his gaze meeting Jason's with a hint of smug satisfaction. Jason could feel the anger boiling inside him, the urge to confront Chad nearly overpowering. But he knew his first priority was Amelia. He had to make sure she was safe before dealing with the man who had stood by and done nothing. As Jason helped Amelia out of the pool, Lisa rushed to their side, her face pale with worry. "Amelia, honey, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling as she knelt beside her daughter. Amelia nodded weakly, her eyes wide and glassy. I got a cramp," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I couldn't move. I thought I was going to drown." Jason held her close, his jaw clenched as he fought to keep his anger in check. "You're safe now," he said firmly, his voice filled with a quiet determination. But even as he reassured his daughter, his gaze flickered back to Chad, who was watching them with that same cold, unfeeling stare. Lisa followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing as she took in the lifeguard's expression. "He didn't do anything, did he?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief and anger. Jason nodded, his jaw tightening. "He just watched. He was right there, and he did nothing." A sense of betrayal washed over Lisa's face as she looked back at Chad, her expression hardening. How could he? He's supposed to protect people. That's his job. Jason didn't respond, but his mind was racing. Chad had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. His inaction had put Amelia's life in danger, and Jason wasn't about to let that go unchallenged. Once Amelia had calmed down, Jason approached the resort's management demanding an explanation. He recounted what had happened, his voice steady but laced with barely contained anger. He described how Chad had failed to act, how he had watched as Amelia struggled, how he had done nothing to help. The manager, a well-dressed woman with a polite but strained expression, listened intently, nodding as Jason spoke. When he finished, she assured him that they would look into the matter, that the resort took the safety of its guests very seriously. But Jason could sense her discomfort, her reluctance to confront the issue directly. "Mr. Smith, I'm very sorry for what your family experienced. We will investigate and ensure that corrective action is taken," she said, her tone professional but distant. Jason clenched his fist, sensing that his concerns were being brushed aside. "That's not enough," he replied, his voice low and firm. "Your lifeguard put my daughter's life at risk. I want to know why he didn't act, and I want to see consequences for his behavior." The manager shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the clipboard in her hands. "Of course, sir. We'll review the incident thoroughly and take appropriate steps." But Jason could tell that she wasn't taking him seriously, that his complaint was being filed away, dismissed as just another grievance from an overprotective father. Frustration surged within him, but he knew that pressing the issue now wouldn't get him anywhere. He'd have to find another way to make sure Chad was held accountable. As he returned to his family, Jason felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. He couldn't rely on the resort to protect his family, not when they were so quick to dismiss his concerns. He'd have to stay vigilant, to keep a close watch on Chad and make sure his family stayed safe. Later that night, as they gathered in their suite, Jason held Amelia close, his heart heavy with guilt and anger. He had come here to give his family a break from the stresses of his job, to escape the dangers that came with his line of work. But now, even in this place of supposed safety, they were facing a threat he hadn't anticipated. Amelia, still shaken but trying to be brave, looked up at her father. "Dad, do you think he did it on purpose?" Jason hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't want to frighten her, didn't want her to carry the weight of the world's cruelty on her shoulders. But he also knew that lying to her wouldn't help. "I don't know, sweetheart," he replied, his voice gentle. "But I promise you, I won't let anything like that happen again." As he held his daughter close, Jason made a silent vow. Chad would answer for what he'd done, one way or another. And Jason would do whatever it took to protect his family from the dangers that lurked even in paradise. The atmosphere in the hospital was stark and clinical, a sharp contrast to the bright, vibrant world of the resort. The sterile smell of antiseptics lingered in the air, and the quiet hum of machinery filled the small room where Amelia lay, her face pale and her eyes closed. She was alive, and she was stable, but the incident had left her weak and shaken, with her breaths coming in shallow, rhythmic patterns as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Jason sat at her bedside, holding her hand tightly, his gaze fixed on her face as he waited for any sign of movement. Lisa was beside him, her face etched with worry, her hands twisting together in her lap. She had barely spoken since they arrived at the hospital, her attention entirely focused on her daughter, her usually calm demeanor shattered by the day's events. Jason had rarely seen her like this. It was as if her entire world had been turned upside down in a single moment, and the weight of her fear hung heavily between them. The doctor entered the room, his white coat pristine, his expression calm yet serious. He glanced at the monitors beside Amelia's bed before addressing Jason and Lisa. "She's stable," he said, his voice reassuring. "She suffered a severe cramp, likely due to dehydration or muscle fatigue, but fortunately, you were able to reach her in time. She'll need rest, but there doesn't appear to be any lasting damage." Jason nodded, relief flooding through him, but beneath it lay a simmering anger, a rage that he had been forced to suppress since the moment he pulled his daughter from the water. He couldn't stop thinking about Chad, about the lifeguard who had watched as Amelia struggled for her life and had done nothing to help. The memory of that smug, cold expression haunted him, and he knew he couldn't let it go. As the doctor left the room, Lisa turned to Jason, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fury. "How could he just stand there and watch?" she whispered, her voice trembling with anger. "He's supposed to be protecting people, Jason. That's his job." Jason clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around Amelia's. "Don't know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm going to find out. He put her life at risk, and he's not getting away with it." For a few moments, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jason's mind was racing, piecing together everything he knew about Chad, every cold glance, every sneer, every moment of hostility that had led to this. He had tried to ignore it, to brush it off as his own paranoia, but now he knew that his instincts had been right all along. Chad was a danger, and Jason couldn't rest until he understood why. As the hours passed, Amelia began to stir, her eyes fluttering open as she slowly regained consciousness. Jason leaned forward, his heart pounding with relief as he watched her blink, her gaze finally focusing on him. "Dad?" she murmured, her voice weak but steady. "I'm here, sweetheart," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, smoothing her hair back from her forehead as he offered her a reassuring smile. "You're safe now. Everything's going to be okay." Amelia nodded, her expression clouded with confusion and lingering fear. I couldn't move," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I was trying to call for help, but he just stood there. He didn't do anything." Jason felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm for her sake. "I know," he replied softly, "and I'm going to make sure he never puts anyone else in danger again." After a long silence, Lisa placed a gentle hand on his arm, her eyes filled with determination. "You have to do something, Jason. We can't just let this go." Jason nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. He had spent his career fighting for justice, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and he wasn't about to let someone like Chad go unpunished. This was no longer just about his family. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever be put at risk by a man who had no respect for human life. The next morning, after making sure that Amelia was comfortable and settled, Jason left the hospital and returned to the resort. His mind was focused, his steps purposeful as he approached the front desk, demanding to speak with the manager. The concierge, taken aback by his intensity, quickly ushered him into a private office where the resort's manager, a polished, middle-aged woman named Miss Lawson, waited with a tense expression. "Mr. Smith," she greeted him, her voice smooth and professional. "I was informed of the incident with your daughter. Please know that we take the safety of our guests very seriously, and I assure you that we're investigating the matter thoroughly." Jason narrowed his eyes, his patience already worn thin. "An investigation isn't enough," he replied, his tone cold. "Your lifeguard, Chad, deliberately ignored a drowning child. He watched my daughter struggle for her life and did nothing. This isn't just a safety issue, it's a matter of negligence or worse." Miss Lawson's expression faltered slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Smith, but I assure you that we have protocols in place. Chad is an experienced lifeguard with a spotless record, and we have no reason to believe he would intentionally endanger a guest." Jason's anger flared, his fists clenching at his sides. "Are you seriously telling me that this was a misunderstanding? I saw him, Miss Lawson. I saw the look on his face, the way he stood there with a smirk as my daughter was drowning. This wasn't an accident." The manager hesitated, glancing down at her desk as if searching for the right words. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Smith," she said finally, her voice softening. "We will review the security footage and conduct a full inquiry, but I ask that you allow us time to handle this internally. Please, consider your family's vacation. We want to ensure that you're able to enjoy the rest of your stay." Jason's gaze hardened, his jaw set. He had been through enough in his career to know when someone was trying to placate him, to brush a problem under the rug. He leaned forward, his voice low and filled with barely contained anger. "I don't want platitudes. I want accountability. And if you won't handle this properly, I will." Miss Lawson's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Of course, Mr. Smith. We will proceed with the investigation and inform you of any developments." Jason left the office, his mind racing with frustration and anger. He knew that the resort's management was more concerned with protecting their reputation than with addressing the true issue at hand. Chad's behavior had been deliberate, calculated, and Jason was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, Jason began his own investigation, using the skills he had developed over years in the FBI. He spoke with other guests, subtly questioning them about Chad, hoping to uncover any information that might reveal the lifeguard's true nature. Most were unaware of anything unusual, but a few mentioned that Chad had always seemed standoffish, indifferent, and that they had occasionally noticed him watching certain guests with an unsettling intensity. The more Jason learned, the more his suspicions grew. He began to piece together a pattern, a series of subtle behaviors that hinted at a deep-seated hostility, a prejudice that Chad had hidden behind his professional facade. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about negligence, it was something darker, something personal. One evening, as he sat in the resort's lounge, reviewing his notes, he noticed a familiar face across the room. It was a guest he had seen speaking with Chad earlier in the week, a man who seemed oddly close to the lifeguard. Jason's instincts kicked in, and he decided to approach the man, hoping to gather more information. The man, whose name was Rick, was initially friendly, engaging Jason in casual conversation. But as soon as Jason mentioned Chad, Rick's demeanor shifted, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around as if making sure they weren't being overheard. "Chad's a complicated guy," Rick said finally, his voice low. "He's got his views, if you know what I mean. Doesn't exactly keep them to himself either." Jason's jaw tightened. "What kind of views?" Rick hesitated, casting a wary glance at Jason. "Let's just say he doesn't think certain people belong in places like this," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's got a chip on his shoulder, and he doesn't mind letting people know it." Jason's anger simmered, but he kept his expression neutral. He thanked Rick and returned to his seat, his mind racing. This was the confirmation he had been looking for, the final piece of the puzzle that explained Chad's hostility, his willingness to stand by as Amelia nearly drowned. Chad's prejudice had nearly cost his daughter her life, and Jason knew he couldn't let it go unpunished. He returned to the hospital that evening, his resolve stronger than ever. He would gather the evidence, confront the resort's management, and ensure that Chad faced the consequences of his actions. And if the resort continued to protect him, Jason was prepared to take his case to the authorities to make sure that justice was served. As he sat by Amelia's bedside, watching her sleep, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This was more than just a fight for his family. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, for the safety of every person who came to this resort seeking peace and safety. And Jason was prepared to see it through, no matter what it took. Returning to the resort the next morning, Jason felt a determination that he hadn't felt in years. He was done being stonewalled and placated by management. He was here for answers, and he wouldn't leave without them. The sterile politeness of the manager's office, the forced apologies, the empty promises to investigate, it all meant nothing to him now. He wanted to confront Chad directly, to see for himself what kind of man would watch a child drown and do nothing. Jason had planned to go straight to Chad's post by the pool, but as he entered the lobby, Miss Lawson, the manager, intercepted him. Her face was calm and composed, but he could see the tension in her eyes. "Mr. Smith," she greeted him with a strained smile. "I understand that this situation has been deeply upsetting for your family, and I assure you that we're handling it as professionally as possible. But please, I would ask you to allow us to continue our investigation without any further escalation." Jason took a breath, fighting to keep his anger in check. "Escalation? Miss Lawson, you have a lifeguard on your staff who watched my daughter struggle in the pool and did nothing. I've given you days, but I've seen no action taken. Your lifeguard is still here, still on duty, as if nothing happened." Miss Lawson's expression faltered. "Mr. Smith, I assure you we're conducting a thorough review. We have protocols and standards to uphold, and we are taking your concerns seriously." Jason clenched his jaw, his voice a low rumble. "Serious concerns don't mean anything without serious action. And until you show me that Chad will be held accountable, I won't stop. Not until the truth is out." With that, he turned on his heel, leaving Miss Lawson standing in the lobby, her face a mixture of irritation and frustration. Jason knew she was caught between protecting the resort's image and placating an angry guest, but this was more than an image issue to him. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that his family and any other family visiting this resort would be safe from people like Chad. He found Chad by the pool, standing at his usual post. The lifeguard was alone, scanning the crowd, his face impassive. But when he saw Jason approaching, his expression changed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Hey," Jason called, his voice cold. "We need to talk." Chad crossed his arms, tilting his head with a faint smirk. "I'm on duty, Smith. I don't have time for whatever it is you're trying to pull here." Jason's fists clenched, his gaze hard. "On duty? The way you were when you watched my daughter nearly drown? Don't think I didn't see you, Chad. You stood there and did nothing." Chad shrugged, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "Maybe if you'd been watching her more closely, it wouldn't have happened. It's not my job to babysit every kid who decides to get in over their head." Jason's blood boiled at Chad's callous tone. "You're a lifeguard. It's literally your job to watch out for people in the water. My daughter was in danger, and you stood there, smiling as if you enjoyed it." Chad's smirk grew, his expression defiant. "People like you think you can come in here and demand whatever you want just because you can afford it. You're used to getting your way, aren't you?" The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He had seen that look in Chad's eyes before, in people who harbored deep-seated prejudices, people who judged others based on nothing more than the color of their skin. This wasn't just negligence, it was hatred. Jason took a steadying breath, his voice low and deadly calm. "This isn't about getting my way, Chad. This is about accountability. You let my daughter suffer because of your own twisted prejudice, and I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are." Chad's sneer faltered, but only for a moment. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Careful, Smith. You don't know who you're dealing with." Jason felt a chill run through him, but he refused to back down. He stood his ground, his gaze locked on Chad's, refusing to be intimidated. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I promise you, Chad, you won't get away with this." With a final glare, Jason turned and walked away, his mind racing. Chad's words had sent a surge of anger through him, but they had also sparked something else, a deep-seated determination to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. That evening, Jason returned to the hospital to check on Amelia, but his mind was already working through a plan. He needed to gather evidence, something concrete that would prove Chad's neglect and prejudice. Without it, he knew Miss Lawson and the resort management would continue to sweep the incident under the rug. As he sat by Amelia's bedside, watching her sleep, Jason felt a sense of clarity settle over him. He wasn't just a father protecting his family. He was a man seeking justice, and he wouldn't stop until Chad was exposed. Over the next few days, Jason put his plan into action. He contacted former colleagues, drawing on his connections to obtain any information he could about Chad's background. He combed through online records, social media profiles, anything that might reveal a history of prejudice or a pattern of neglect. It wasn't long before he found exactly what he had been looking for. A quick online search led him to a series of posts on a private social media group, posts filled with hateful rhetoric and disturbing comments. The account wasn't in Chad's name, but Jason recognized his face in the profile picture. The posts contained remarks about certain groups not belonging in places like Laguna Bay, complaints about entitled tourists, and even references to incidents where he had let them suffer as his own form of twisted justice. The discovery filled Jason with a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. He finally had the evidence he needed, proof that Chad's inaction hadn't been an accident, but a deliberate choice driven by prejudice. He knew it wouldn't be enough to fire Chad outright, but it was a start, and with the right pressure, it would be enough to force the resort's hand. Armed with his evidence, Jason returned to Miss Lawson's office, this time more determined than ever. She greeted him with the same strained politeness, but Jason could see the unease in her eyes as he presented her with the screenshots, the hateful comments, the evidence that Chad's actions had been anything but professional. "This is your lifeguard," Jason said, his voice cold and steady. "This is the man you're defending, the man who watched a child nearly drown because of his own twisted beliefs. If you don't take action, I will. And I promise you, this resort will be known for exactly the kind of people you allow on your staff." Miss Lawson's face turned pale, her professional facade crumbling as she looked over the evidence. "Mr. Smith, I had no idea," she stammered, her voice shaky. This isn't the kind of behavior we condone at Laguna Bay. I assure you we will take immediate action." Jason didn't respond, his gaze hard as he watched her process the gravity of the situation. He had done his part, and now it was up to the resort to follow through. But he knew that his fight wasn't over. Chad might be removed from his post, but there was a deeper issue at play, a systemic problem that allowed people like him to go unchecked. As he left the office, Jason felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by a lingering anger. He had achieved a victory, but it wasn't enough. This incident had opened his eyes to a world of prejudice and injustice that extended far beyond his family's experience, and he knew that he couldn't turn his back on it. That evening, Jason sat with his family, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He had protected them, fought for their safety and their dignity, but he knew that his work wasn't done. He had a new purpose, a renewed commitment to fighting for justice, not just for his family, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel unwelcome, unwanted, or unsafe. And as he looked into Amelia's eyes, filled with gratitude and strength, he knew that he would continue to fight, no matter the cost. The days that followed brought a mix of relief and anticipation for Jason and his family. After Jason had presented the evidence, Miss Lawson informed him that the resort had suspended Chad pending a full investigation. She assured him that Chad would be permanently dismissed if the findings confirmed his prejudice-fueled negligence. But for Jason, this was only a partial victory. He wanted to ensure that his family and all future guests would never face such treatment again. The story of what happened to Amelia had spread through the resort, and whispers circulated among guests. People had noticed Chad's cold demeanor before, but few had ever imagined that he could have harbored such blatant hatred. Other families who had once felt uneasy now connected the dots, remembering the lifeguard's attitude toward certain guests, a realization that only intensified the undercurrent of concern. Jason was encouraged by the support he and his family received from other guests and even some staff members who shared his outrage. It was clear that the incident had impacted more than just his family. It had shaken the trust in the very place they had come to for rest and escape. Yet Jason's mind remained restless. The resort had promised accountability, but he wanted to see real change. Concrete action that would prevent similar situations in the future. He found himself reflecting on the deeper issues that had come to light. The systemic flaws that allowed someone like Chad to act on his prejudice unchecked. And he knew that merely firing one lifeguard wouldn't be enough. That evening, as the Smith family gathered for dinner, a sense of calm had finally begun to settle over them. Amelia, though still recovering emotionally, seemed stronger, her natural resilience shining through as she enjoyed her family's company. But just as they began to relax, Miss Lawson approached their table, her expression serious yet respectful. "Mr. Smith," she began, addressing Jason directly, "if you don't mind, I'd like a moment of your time to discuss the resolution of this matter." Jason nodded, exchanging a reassuring glance with Lisa before following Miss Lawson to a quieter corner of the restaurant. "First, let me apologize once again for the experience your family endured," Miss Lawson said, her voice steady but sincere. "I know words can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that we've taken your complaint to heart. After reviewing the evidence and speaking with other staff members, we've made the decision to terminate Chad effective immediately. Additionally, we've taken steps to ensure that all staff undergo a thorough background check moving forward, with a particular focus on identifying any potential prejudices." Jason felt a sense of satisfaction at her words, but he remained composed, waiting to hear what else she had to say. Furthermore, Miss Lawson continued, "we are implementing a diversity and inclusivity training program for all employees, as well as establishing a guest feedback system so that any concerns, especially those related to safety and respect, can be addressed directly and transparently." This experience has shown us that our current protocols were insufficient, and we are committed to making lasting improvements. Jason nodded slowly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "That's a start," he said, his voice calm. "But I hope you understand that it's not just about training. It's about changing the culture, ensuring that everyone feels welcome here." Miss Lawson's gaze softened, a hint of understanding in her eyes. "You have my word, Mr. Smith. We're committed to fostering an environment where all guests feel safe and valued. I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, and I regret that it had to happen under such circumstances." As Jason returned to his family, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He knew that Miss Lawson's promises were only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. He could sense that the resort was genuinely committed to change, and he felt a renewed hope that his actions had made a difference, not only for his family, but for everyone who would come to this place in the future. The following day, as they prepared to leave, Jason received a call from one of his former colleagues. Word of the incident had reached beyond the resort, sparking interest from local media. Reporters wanted to cover the story, to bring attention to the larger issue of discrimination in public spaces. They saw Jason as a voice of accountability, a figure who had challenged prejudice and fought for justice. After a moment's thought, Jason agreed to share his story. It wasn't about revenge or publicity. It was about ensuring that no one else would face the same danger and humiliation that his family had endured. He felt a responsibility to speak up, to use his voice to promote awareness and change, and he knew that his story, painful though it was, could serve as a catalyst for much-needed reform. When the family finally left the resort, Jason looked back at the sprawling grounds with a mixture of gratitude and resolution. This place had brought them pain, but it had also given him the opportunity to stand up for what he believed in. It had tested his strength and his commitment to justice, reminding him of why he had chosen his path in life. As they drove away, Amelia reached over, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "For everything." Jason looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart," he replied. "I did what any father would do." But he knew it was more than that. This experience had reminded him of the importance of vigilance, of standing up against injustice, even in places where it seemed least likely to appear. He had protected his family, yes, but he had also taken a stand, one that he hoped would echo beyond the walls of that resort, reaching others who needed to hear it. As they drove on, Jason felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun, and with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that together they could make a difference in the world. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new episodes. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We value your opinion. And check out the other videos on our channel for more interesting and inspiring stories. See you in the next issue.